Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Welcome, Jim. Thought we'd talk a little bit about Syria, get a sit rep on what's going on there. In fact, there's a lot, isn't there?
Well, yes and no. Basically, Syria, the war is not over. There are three separate, how should I put it, parts of Syria, only one of which is about two-thirds of the territory, is under the control of the Syrian government and the Iranians. The Kurds up in the northeast are still chasing down stray ISIL, groups. In fact, they are still carrying out suicide attacks, mainly against the Kurds, obviously. The Russians resumed bombing Idlib, that's the province up in the northwest, where the remaining al-Qaeda factions are. Now, the factions are also fighting each other. And it's still not decided if they're going to attack. But what they are doing is putting pressure on the Turks, who are trying to establish some kind of ceasefire to basically go along with an attack. The Turks don't want that because a lot of the refugees are going to head for Turkey. Now, they probably wouldn't get through, not many of them, because they built a wall. Sometimes walls do work. And the Turks are determined not to have any more. Now, the Turks at the same time are offering a lot of the Syrian refugees, who are almost entirely Sunni Muslims, a pathway, as it were, to Turkish citizenship. Turkey already has a large Arab minority. And as long as they have those refugees, they can extort billions of dollars from the EU. They are regularly getting paid for that, for keeping their border with Greece closed. So the war isn't over yet, and it's still unclear. Basically it comes down to the Turks and the Iranians. Oh yes, and the what do you call it? The Israelis just bombed a Iranian base up by Aleppo yesterday or today. So that's firing up again. The Iranians are still bringing in weapons. They're just doing it more discreetly. For example, they're bringing in the GPS for converting the longer range missiles to guided missiles, and they're bringing them in civilian luggage on passenger flights. The Israelis aren't, going after. And they're trying to bring in more material by sea, which is difficult because there's a blockade there. The Israelis are right there. The Syria is running out of oil because the oil embargo on Iran is working. So the country's still a mess. The Iranians have announced that they're going to build 200,000 housing units, and they're going to be basically in and around Damascus. And I suspect most of them are going to go to the Iranian mercenaries, including a lot of Afghans, who have been invited to settle in Syria. How's that for occupation? The Lebanese Hezbollah is complaining that they haven't got any money. That's because the Iranians have apparently cut the budget for Syria and Hezbollah because they have unrest back in Iran, which has not abated. So there's, this is a very complicated situation. It's not changing quickly. That's the thing. It's not a headline maker, except for the occasional Israeli, airstrike, which always, gets headlines. And the Turks, the Iranians, and the Russians, and the Syrians, just for a show, have been meeting regularly, trying to work things out. But it hasn't worked. Oh, and this is interesting. Assad, at the end of February, made his first foreign visit since 2011. And he basically spent a few days in Iran kissing the appropriate rings or whatever he kissed, to basically assure his masters that he is indeed going to do what they want him to do. There is some concern because the Arab League had made noises to Syria that they'd let them rejoin the Arab League. The Saudis have made noises about, hey, we'll give you billions of dollars to rebuild. And the Iranians apparently told them, we'll cut your throat if you do any of that. And so guess who's more convincing? So basically, the situation hasn't changed that much. There's not a lot of fighting going on. Most of the casualties are civilians killed by the Russian bombing. The Americans and the American Air Coalition is still flying missions over Syria, but there are very few targets. We still have troops with the SDF, the Kurdish-led militia, which is about 80%, Kurdish, but there's still a lot of Arabs and Turkic and various other minorities there with them. They've always gotten along together in the Northeast, where the Kurds have been a majority. The Kurds have made approaches to Assad about, hey, let's do an autonomy deal, something like in Iraq. The Turks have said, don't you dare. The Turks are still threatening to basically move east across the Euphrates and establish their security zone 30 kilometers, from the into Syria, all along the border. But so far they haven't done that because they basically don't want a bloodbath. Oh, and of course in Turkey there's elections and the Islamic Party may lose. So that's got the Turks nervous because if they get a new government, that changes the whole thing. In fact, the Turks might just say, screw it, we're pulling out. Bye-bye, good luck. We're going to build more walls. So that's it in a nutshell.
Now, what are the chances of Russian troops staying in Syria after everything settles down even more?
That's pretty much 100% because they signed treaties with Syria, with the government of Syria. This is all done officially. They get the use of a port in Tartus. That's one of the ports on the Syrian coast. And they have the Himenen air base, which they've taken over. That's where most of their air operations come from. The Russians are willing to stay. They're willing to supply. They're already supplying a lot of military equipment and tech support. They're not giving the Syrians a lot of money per se, but the Russians do have a lot of spare parts for the older Cold War era equipment that the Syrians still have left. We ran a piece in Strategy Page recently on rebuilding the Syrian armored force, and the Russians did give the Syrians some T-90 tanks, but that was mainly for field testing. And they found out they needed an active protection system, which, of course, the Israelis have the best ones, but they're not selling to the Russians. Because the T-90s were vulnerable to the old American TOW anti-tank missile, which is the primary one that you'll encounter inside Syria. Either the original American version, which we gave to some of the rebel groups, and the Iranians have a knockoff. They basically cloned it, and it's close enough. I mean, heck, it's 50-year-old technology. But the beauty of the TOW is it's wire guided, so you can't use one of these new electronic disruptors, protection systems, which work pretty well. But that's only if we're using an electronic or not using a fire and forget. These disruptors are apparently have a hard time once they've the latest anti-tank missiles. Basically, the gunner gets the image of the vehicle. It's stored in if it can be found in the fire control missile fire control systems database. It acknowledges, he clicks and fires, and basically the missile just homes in on an image. That can be disrupted, but it's more difficult. So anyway, the T-90 is vulnerable, but otherwise it works. But then, of course, the thing is, the T-90 is basically another improved T-72, and even the Russians bought some but they put most of them into storage, and they're using another cheaper version of an improved T-72. So basically, the Russians are giving the Syrians all the spare parts from unused. The Russians don't throw anything away. And a few people in there to help them repair. But the Syrians are basically doing all the repairs themselves. But basically, they're only going to end up at best with about 20% of the armored force they had before the war. So they're they're no longer a threat to Israel as they were in 2011. The big problem is the Iranians, who want to basically upgrade a lot of the longer range, 100 or more kilometer range ballistic missiles or long range rockets that they've already supplied to Hezbollah, and the Syrians have some too, and the Israelis appear to have a understanding with Russia when they launch attacks, airstrikes, because the Russians basically don't complain as much. The Russians and the Iranians are not getting along. They have arguments. For example, the Iranians want to sign a deal with Syria to get port use, even though they're under embargo. And there'd be a lot of, how should I put it, countries objecting to that. And obviously, the Iranians wanted to be sure that Assad realized who he was reporting to, thus the visit to Iran. But it's still a mess. The war's not over, and basically the final act, as it were, is stalled. So it's a basic snafu situation. Normal, all fouled up.
Now, one of the things is that ISIL has been declared defeated, but is there a chance that they will reconstitute themselves there in Syria again, or is there another country that they're going to try to put their base at?
Well, the most likely place where they might establish a base is Afghanistan, of all places. Every place else that they've tried, they've run into heavy resistance. And Afghanistan is not an ideal place for a base because it's really out of the way. If they're there, they have to keep a low profile. They're under constant attack by other Islamic terrorist groups, even Al Qaeda faction, which there is welcome in Afghanistan, is constantly fighting with them. Taliban's constantly fighting with them. The pariahs, but the idea of ISIL, in other words, we are the baddest of the baddest. We are the most Islamic of Islamic terrorist groups who are basically defending Islam, mainly from other Muslims, and they are attracting all the people who are disaffected with other groups. So they get basically all the other Islamic terror groups, and there are a lot of them around still. Basically, if you join and you feel that your guys are not fanatic enough, there's usually an ISIL faction around. I mean, even the Philippines has a small one. So a lot of the surviving ISIL personnel in Syria and even Iraq are looking for another place to go, someplace that's less dangerous, because their lifespans in places like Syria and Iraq are low. Now, another interesting, this is talking about ISIL personnel, the families, the SDF has a large refugee camp, which has about 70,000 people on it. These are civilians. They came out of the ISIL, territory as it shrank. They would usually, if they always made the offer of, send out the women and children, and we'll basically safeguard them, and they have. But as has been in the news about, European countries, canceling the citizenship of women or sometimes girls, teenagers who went to Syria and married, ISIL guys who then proceeded to get themselves killed. They are still fanatics, and it's a big problem in the camps where these women, it reminds me of World War II. where the POW camps, we had to eventually separate the Nazis from the majority of Germans who were not Nazis. It was a huge problem. Same thing in the Korea War. We found out when we captured a lot of North Koreans or Chinese, we had to separate the hardcore communists from the average guy who didn't want to be there, in Korea in the first place or in a war. So that's not a new problem, but they are desperately trying to unload these civilian refugees, most of whom are technically not Syrian. If they're Syrian, they can hand them over to Assad. He'd be glad to kill most of them. Turn the children, put the children in an orphanage or something like that. Who knows? I mean, they can be pretty brutal over there. Westerners have a hard time coming to grips with that. That a lot of countries in the Middle East, and including China and Russia, they still believe it's perfectly okay to go after the civilian population. I mean, this has been military strategy 101 for thousands of years. Sun Tzu, I think even Machiavelli said, well, yes, go ravish their lands and force them to make a peace deal. And this is still, the commonly accepted way to go about, fighting a war in most of the world. And that's why most of the targets the Russians are hitting in Idlib province are civilians. If they can cause a panic, they can basically get the civilians to stampede for Turkey, but the Turks have several lines of defenses, as it were, to discourage that. And the Turks apparently are not unwilling to shoot, women and children trying to get in. There are precious few men left. And of course, if they try and get out, the Turks will just try them or turn them over to the Syrians to do it. So there's no way out for these guys. But there are still plenty of young men in the Middle East and Muslims who are willing to basically do a little suicide mission. That's basically what it amounts to. You're a hero for a while, then you're dead. Go figure. But that's been a problem with Islam for over 1,000 years. They don't like to talk about it. I mean, they do talk about it among themselves. It's showing up a lot in the Muslim majority countries in the media, but it rarely gets picked up by the Western media. It's not part of the narrative or whatever. We don't like to acknowledge that sort of thing goes on. The only place where you'll find regular translations easily available is the Israelis, the Palestinian Media Watch. They have a website, I think, but they regularly, pass out to the Western media the latest translations, and this will turn your stomach. The way they encourage kids, to become suicide bombers. I mean, this just has an example of the mentality we're dealing with here and why there's always going to be an ISIL. The Palestinians had their aid cut off because it's become widely known. It's been going on for years, but it's become widely known because of Palestinian Media Watch and other outlets in Israel that the Palestinians, the Fatah in the West Bank, and Hamas does this as well. They spend a lot of their foreign aid in paying monthly payments to imprisoned terrorists, and they pay large sums of money and pensions to widows of dead terrorists. And when the money got tight recently, the Fatah said to their civil servants, because they basically administer most of the West Bank, they said, we're going to have to cut your pay so we can maintain the payments to our heroes in jail, or their families. Basically the heroic and much honored and regularly paid terrorists. So that's what you're dealing with, and that's why ISIL is not going to disappear. It is generally reviled by most Muslim countries because of their brutality. In fact, this has been a debate going on inside the Islamic, terrorist organizations since Al Qaeda got hammered in Iraq in 2007 and 2008. They are basically advising, don't kill a lot of civilians. Even now, in the last 10 years, something like 90% of the people killed by Islamic terrorists have been other Muslims. either deliberately because they're Shia or there's some flavor of Muslim that they don't agree with, they consider heretics, or simply because they got in the way. And ISIL calls them involuntary martyrs, which doesn't go down well with the potential involuntary martyrs. That's why Al Qaeda quickly disappeared from Saudi Arabia after 2004, I think. Saudi Arabia tolerated them until we invaded Iraq. And then Al Qaeda insisted that Saudi Arabia declare war on the United States. That didn't happen, so they decided to go and attack targets, which they had never done before, in Saudi Arabia. And of course, the Saudi population suddenly found out that we no longer support Islamic terrorism, especially if it's against us. And poof, they all went to Yemen, which is even there in Yemen. There are very few ISIL ISIL personnel operational. So they are still around. They are still considered heroes by a fairly significant minority of Muslims. I mean, this has been shown again and again in opinion surveys in Europe and even in North America. Now, it's a small percentage, but when you're talking, more than 1% of, hundreds of, well, let me see, you've got 40 million Muslims in Western countries, 1% of that, that's a large number. These are people and at various degrees of support. So, it's probably more than 10% will tolerate, Muslims attacking, non-Muslims or using violence in defense of Islam. So no, ISIL is not going to go away. It's getting smaller. It's going to stay smaller. It's always been there. Before all the oil money came along, and you had mass media in satellite TV in Muslim nations, you simply didn't hear about it. Our coverage of Pakistan shows that the Muslim on Muslim violence was there from the beginning. As soon as they created Pakistan, you had this huge transfer of populations, non-Muslims going from Pakistan to India, and some Muslims going from India into Pakistan. The Muslims coming from India were never totally accepted. They're still considered outsiders, even though they are Sunni Muslims. And there are still terrorist groups that have been since the late 1940s in Pakistan, which will murder these other, Muslims, because they're not our kind of Muslims. So this is the mentality. The Quran, Islam is the only major religion which still has scripture that explicitly, justifies, this sort of violence. Every other major religion, says, you got to fight back, yada, yada. But, for example, the Christians have Jesus saying, render unto Caesar what is Caesar, render unto God what is God. In other words, he recognized the existence of church and state. We believe you should lead a good Christian life, but that doesn't mean you get ruled by a bishop or a pope or whatever, which is the propaganda that Protestants for long, many of them still do, used against the Catholics that somehow the papacy was to, revive the whole Roman Empire, where the Pope thought he had a lot of authority, but never did. So Islam doesn't have a pope. They don't have any unified, authority, with the possible exception of the religious schools in Egypt. But even then, their influence is limited. They're very knowledgeable on the Quran and interpretations or what have you, but you don't have to listen to them. And so you're always going to have it. And it's basically a side effect of affluence in the Muslim countries. A lot of the oil money was not spent on developing the economy. This is a problem they're now trying to rectify because the oil is going to be running out. If somebody finally comes up with an efficient fusion, power generation system, it's all over for anybody who's dependent on oil. But the only good thing you can say is the latest generation of Muslim rulers, in many countries who are dependent on oil, are trying to do something about this. But you can't automatically undo, decades, a couple generations of young Muslims who had the option of basically studying religion, getting a do-nothing government job, and going to the mosque every Friday and getting harangued about how we really should do something about these non-Muslims. They shouldn't exist, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's vile stuff. I've had friends, in New York, what I call, the dual culture, bicultural, basically Arabs or whatever, or Malaysians who work on Wall Street or pass through. And I meet them at parties. They usually have a drink in their hands, so to show that they're not hardcore, if nothing else, or they just like good scotch. And they'll go on about it. It's a hassle, Whenever they go back home, they got to basically change their lifestyle because it's a whole different mentality there. They can criticize off the record, this ISIL and all this, Islamic terrorism. But you go back home and you basically keep your mouth shut because you're suspect for just spending so much time in the West. Wearing Western clothes, doing business with the kafirs, the non-believers. So the problem is there. And basically, it's easier to become an Islamic terrorist these days because there's more money floating around in Muslim countries for, you can shake down a wealthy Muslim, and this is an art form in the Gulf oil states. Basically, it's like before the Reformation, selling indulgences. The Mujahideen, soldier of God, comes up to you and says, "Gee, I think you have a much better reputation by our group if you gave money to our charity." And boom, you got more payroll for Islamic terrorists. So no, ISIL is always going to be around, but because they have made themselves persona non grata with the vast majority of Muslims, including Islamic conservatives, they are going to have a difficult time establishing territory they control. But they're going to still keep killing people. And most of those people are going to be other Muslims. So there you go. It ain't over. It'll never be, as far as we can tell.
All right. Well, we'll wrap it up there and talk to you next time.
Take care.
All right. Bye.